John walked into the small, cozy coffee shop, glancing around nervously. The soft hum of chatter and the rich smell of coffee filled the air, but for some reason, it didn't make him feel relaxed. He had been looking forward to this blind date all week, or at least trying to. Blind dates were always a mix of excitement and dread, and today, his stomach was doing somersaults. He spotted the table near the window that he had been told to sit at. A single chair sat there, waiting. He took a deep breath and sat down, placing his coffee cup on the table. He hoped his date would arrive soon, because the quietness of the place suddenly felt heavier than usual. Minutes passed. Then a few more. John checked his watch again and again. 5 minutes late. 10. He tried to convince himself that maybe she had been stuck in traffic or lost her way. That seemed reasonable. But as the minutes ticked by, a small voice in his head began to whisper, "What if she doesn't show up? What if this whole thing was a mistake?" He looked around the coffee shop, trying to distract himself. Couples laughed across the room, friends were chatting and sipping their drinks, and a barista called out orders with cheerful energy. Everyone seemed to belong there, everyone except him. He rubbed his hands together nervously and tried to imagine what his date might be like. Would she laugh at his jokes? Would she like the same music? Did she even drink coffee? All of these thoughts whirled in his mind, making the wait feel even longer. To pass the time, John took a sip of his coffee, but it did little to calm his nerves. The warmth of the cup couldn't chase away the awkward feeling creeping up his spine. He noticed the barista giving him a polite nod, as if she could tell he was waiting for someone. That made him feel even more self-conscious. Every time the door opened, his heart jumped, thinking maybe it was her, only to be disappointed by strangers walking in. He tried to occupy himself by scrolling through his phone, but the words on the screen blurred as his mind kept returning to the empty chair across from him. Every laugh from another table, every chatter from friends seemed to mock him silently. Why had he agreed to this? He wondered. Blind dates were always risky. Sometimes they turned into wonderful stories, but often they ended with disappointment and awkward goodbyes. He didn't want this to be one of those. After nearly 20 minutes, he leaned back in his chair and let out a small sigh. He looked around again and noticed the barista cleaning a nearby table, moving with ease and purpose. How could she seem so calm when he was a bundle of nerves? He thought maybe he should just get up and leave, maybe go somewhere else, maybe even pretend the date was cancelled. But just as he started to reach for his coat, the sound of the door opening made him freeze. His heart leapt. Could it finally be her? A woman walked in, holding a coffee cup, scanning the room. John's stomach tightened. But then he realized she wasn't looking at him. She passed by, smiled at the barista, and took a seat at another table. His heart sank. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe he really was going to spend the next hour alone, sitting across from an empty chair, imagining a conversation that would never happen. He sighed again, this time more deeply, and rested his arms on the table. The chair across from him looked emptier than ever. John tried to focus on something else, anything else. He looked at the menu, pretending to study it, but he already knew what he wanted, a simple latte, nothing fancy. His mind kept wandering back to the idea of the blind date. He wondered if she was having second thoughts, or if something urgent had come up. The possibilities raced through his head, each one worse than the last. As he stared at the empty chair, John tried to make a joke in his head to ease the tension. Well, at least I'll have the whole table to myself, he thought, but it didn't make him smile. Instead, it made him feel even more alone. He could imagine telling this story later, about the blind date that never happened, but he didn't want it to be that kind of story. He wanted laughter, connection, maybe even a spark of something more. And so he sat there, sipping his coffee, shifting in his seat, hoping, waiting, and trying not to imagine the worst. Every sound, every movement in the shop made him glance up, hoping to see her walking through the door. Every laugh made his heart jump. It was awkward, tense, and uncertain, but in a way, it was also full of quiet anticipation, the kind that makes a story worth telling, even before anything has happened. John tried to distract himself, but the empty chair across from him seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching the cream swirl into the dark liquid, yet even that small motion did little to calm his nerves. He glanced around the coffee shop again, hoping for some sign that his date might be on her way. Couples were laughing, friends were chatting, and a few people tapped away on their laptops. The energy of the room was lively, but for John, it only highlighted the silence of his own table. He felt like an island in a sea of connection. He checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, grimacing. 5 minutes late. 10. Maybe 15. John's thoughts began to spin in circles. What if she forgot? What if she changed her mind? He shook his head, trying to push the negative ideas away, but they clung stubbornly. He imagined her walking past the shop without noticing him, or worse, realizing this blind date wasn't her idea of fun at all. The thought made his stomach tighten. To distract himself, he picked up his phone, scrolling through messages he had already read several times. Nothing felt interesting. Even the social media posts of friends having fun somewhere else felt like reminders that he was alone. He tried to laugh at himself quietly. "Relax, John," he whispered under his breath, "it's just a blind date. How awkward can it really get?" But the words sounded hollow, even to him. He started thinking about the blind date process itself, why people still agreed to it in this modern, fast-paced world. Matching apps, swiping left and right, endless texting, and yet here he was, in person, facing a stranger. It was exciting, yes, but also terrifying. What if they didn't click? What if conversation dried up after the first few minutes? He had been on dates before, some good, some awkward, some downright disastrous, and the memory of those moments lingered. He imagined the story he might tell his friends afterward. "So, I went on this blind date, and guess what? No one showed up." He tried to laugh at that thought, but it came out more like a sigh. A group of teenagers walked past the table, chatting loudly, carrying half-eaten pastries. Their carefree energy made him feel even more tense. Why couldn't life just slow down for him for a moment? Why did it feel like every laugh and smile around him was a subtle reminder that he was still waiting? He pushed the thought away and reminded himself, patience is a virtue. John's mind then began wandering in a more unusual direction. Maybe she was watching him from outside, nervous, trying to work up the courage to come in. Maybe she had gotten lost, trying to navigate the streets with her phone's GPS. Or maybe, just maybe, she was running late because something important came up, family, work, an unexpected emergency. The more he considered these possibilities, the more he realized how little control he had over the situation. He took a deep breath, trying to remind himself that whatever happened, it was out of his hands. Still, doubts crept in, whispering questions he didn't want to answer. Did she even want to meet him? Was this whole setup really meant to work? What if the chemistry was completely gone the moment they locked eyes? The thoughts were relentless, spinning in circles like a carousel he couldn't get off. John picked up his coffee again and took a long sip, letting the warmth settle his nerves for a moment. He noticed a few friendly smiles from the barista and other customers, but even those brief gestures couldn't fully erase the tension in his chest. The longer he waited, the more he realized how much hope and fear could coexist in one small coffee shop. As he sat there, he tried to make a game out of the waiting. He would guess which couple might be the next to leave, or which stranger walking through the door would trigger a hopeful glance. Each time the door opened, his heart leapt, only to sink when it wasn't her. The cycle of hope and disappointment made the time feel both slow and endless. By now, John was restless. He shifted in his chair, stretched his arms, and even tried doodling on a napkin, anything to pass the time. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary, or at least unusual, was about to happen. The quiet anticipation built a strange energy around him, a mixture of nervousness, curiosity, and the faint hope that the empty chair might not stay empty for long. John was starting to feel like the universe was playing a quiet little joke on him. The longer he waited, the more he convinced himself that perhaps the blind date had been cancelled without anyone bothering to tell him. He absent-mindedly stirred his coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl lazily in his cup, wondering if he should just leave and salvage some dignity before things got even more awkward. Just as he was about to reach for his coat, the door of the coffee shop opened with a sudden whoosh, letting in a gust of cool air. He glanced up instinctively, his heart skipping a beat, fully expecting to see his date. But what walked in was not the woman he was expecting. 3 small girls marched through the doorway like tiny generals on a mission. They each wore brightly colored backpacks and held hands tightly, their eyes scanning the room with serious determination. John blinked, confused, and then laughed quietly to himself. Were they lost? He watched as they weaved through the tables, their tiny shoes clattering softly against the wooden floor. One of the girls, the tallest and seemingly the leader, stopped in the middle of the coffee shop and looked directly at him. "There he is," she exclaimed, pointing at John with a wide grin. The other 2 followed her gaze, giggling uncontrollably. John froze. What was happening? Who were these little girls, and why were they looking at him like he was the answer to a secret mission? Before he could say anything, the tallest girl ran the last few steps to his table and plopped down on a chair that was clearly too big for her. "My dad is sorry he's late," she announced proudly. John's confusion deepened. "My dad?" he asked slowly, trying to piece it together. The girl nodded vigorously. "Yes. He had work. But he said we could come meet you first," she explained, her 2 sisters nodding and bouncing excitedly on the chairs beside her. They began chattering to each other in quick, overlapping voices, exchanging giggles and pointing at John like he was part of some secret game. John's nervousness began to melt into amusement. He tried to keep a straight face, but the sight of 3 little girls taking charge of a blind date was too funny. He looked around the coffee shop, hoping no one was staring, but most of the customers were smiling quietly at the unusual scene unfolding. Even the barista seemed entertained, her eyes twinkling behind the counter. One of the girls leaned forward and whispered conspiratorially to John, "We picked the best table for you. Daddy says it's perfect." Her serious tone contrasted hilariously with the tiny, mischievous grin on her face. John chuckled, realizing that these little girls were making his awkward blind date somehow even more memorable. The girls began exploring the table, poking at the sugar packets, and pretending to pour invisible tea into tiny cups. John joined in, playing along with their game, and laughed when one of the girls declared, "This tea is magic. It makes people happy." He realized that he hadn't laughed this freely in a long time. The awkwardness that had filled the last 30 minutes had completely vanished, replaced by a warm, light-hearted energy that only children could bring. As John sipped his coffee again, one of the girls tugged gently on his sleeve. "Do you like chocolate muffins?" she asked eagerly. "We got you one. Daddy says it's his favorite, so it must be yours too." Before John could respond, she ran off to the counter and returned with a tiny muffin, placing it carefully in front of him. He laughed, genuinely touched by the gesture. He leaned back in his chair, still shaking his head in disbelief. This was not how he had imagined the blind date going. The empty chair, the tension, the nerves, it had all disappeared the moment 3 little girls had taken charge. They had turned a potentially awkward morning into a moment full of joy, innocence, and unexpected humor. As he watched them chatter and giggle, John realized something important. Sometimes life didn't follow the plan. Sometimes it threw surprises your way that were even better than anything you could have imagined. And right now, sitting at that table with 3 tiny generals leading the show, John understood that the best moments were often the ones you never saw coming. The coffee shop felt warmer, livelier, and somehow magical. John smiled, feeling a strange mix of amusement and gratitude. The blind date that had started empty had suddenly transformed into something extraordinary, and he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. John watched the three little girls chatter and giggle across the table, their energy bouncing off the walls like sunlight. He had just about gotten used to the idea that this blind date was no longer about him meeting an unknown adult, but instead about navigating the chaos of three tiny, whirlwind personalities. Just as he leaned back to take a sip of his coffee, the tallest girl leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with excitement, and said again, "My dad is sorry he's late." John raised an eyebrow. "Your dad," he repeated, still trying to piece it all together. The girls nodded vigorously, their tiny heads bobbing like little bauble dolls. "Yes," one of them squeaked. "He had work, but he said we could meet you first. We're helping him." John blinked. Slowly, the situation began to make sense. These little girls weren't random strangers, they were here on a mission. They were here to represent their father until he could make it. And in the most charming way possible, they had taken over the entire blind date. Before he could ask another question, the middle girl leaned across the table and said, "Daddy said you like muffins, so we got you one. It's chocolate chip." She carefully placed a tiny plate in front of John. He looked at it, smiling, and realized that the little gestures from these children carried an innocence and sincerity that no adult could replicate. "Wow," John said, laughing softly. "Thank you. That's really thoughtful." The girls beamed. "We have to be helpful. Daddy said blind dates are scary sometimes, and we're helping." John chuckled. The way they said it, with absolute seriousness, was adorable. "Helping me?" he asked, playing along. "Yes," the tallest one said. "We're making sure it's a good date. You'll see. He said that if we behave and make it fun, everything will be perfect." The other two nodded, then quickly began pointing out chairs, rearranging napkins, and even making sure the sugar packets were perfectly lined up. John laughed, realizing that the girls were running the entire show. He took another sip of coffee and leaned back, watching them. Their tiny voices and laughter filled the space, and for the first time in weeks, he felt completely at ease. There was no awkward silence, no nervous fidgeting, no pressure. Just three little girls creating an atmosphere of fun, warmth, and acceptance. The tallest girl suddenly tilted her head and asked, "Do you like chocolate milk too?" John laughed, shaking his head. "I like coffee better, but chocolate milk is good too," he said. The girls nodded, satisfied with his answer, and continued their playful chatter. They even started making up tiny games for him to play along with, like pretending the sugar packets were tiny treasure chests and that his coffee cup was a magical potion. John realized something important in that moment. The date had started as a potentially awkward, quiet morning, filled with doubt and anxiety. But now, sitting here with these little girls leading the way, it had transformed into something completely unexpected, something joyful, spontaneous, and unforgettable. The tension that had made him fidget and check his watch so many times had melted away entirely. He smiled to himself and thought, this is more than just a blind date. This is an adventure. Just then, the door to the coffee shop opened again. A man rushed in, slightly out of breath, carrying a briefcase and wearing a wide, apologetic smile. He scanned the room, then his eyes landed on John sitting at the table surrounded by three energetic little girls. The man's face lit up, and he started walking toward them, waving. "Sorry I'm late," he called out as he approached. "Work ran over, and traffic was terrible." The girls jumped up and ran to him. "Daddy, this is him. This is the man we told you about." The man crouched down, scooping them into his arms one by one for hugs, all while looking at John with a mixture of relief and gratitude. John stood up, smiling, and extended his hand. "Hi, I'm John. Nice to finally meet you," he said. The man laughed, shaking his hand warmly. "Mark. And I really appreciate you waiting. I see my kids have already taken over the date, though," he added, smiling at the three little whirlwind girls. John grinned. "I don't mind. They're amazing. I think they've already made this the best blind date I've ever been on." Mark laughed again, looking genuinely relieved. That's exactly what I hoped for. Thanks for being so patient. And thank you for letting the girls, well, run the show for a while. John nodded. He realized then that the girls had not just entertained him, they had bridged the gap, breaking the initial awkwardness and creating a connection that would have been impossible otherwise. And just like that, the pieces fell into place. The blind date, which had started as an empty chair and an anxious wait, had now transformed into laughter, warmth, and the start of a story John would never forget. The moment Mark arrived, the atmosphere at the table shifted entirely. John could feel it, a sense of relief, excitement, and a little bit of chaos all rolled into one. The three girls, still buzzing with energy, had clearly completed their mission of keeping him entertained, but now their father had arrived, and the real date could begin. Or so John thought. Mark crouched down to greet his daughters with quick hugs and whispered reassurances, and John stood nearby, awkwardly unsure of how to join the family scene without ruining the playful energy the girls had created. But then one of the girls, probably the youngest, with big round eyes full of mischief, grabbed John's hand and tugged him toward her father. "Daddy, this is John. He's the man we told you about." Mark's eyes widened in surprise, and then a warm smile spread across his face. "John. I'm so glad you waited. And wow, you've met the team already, huh?" He gestured toward his daughters, who were practically vibrating with excitement. John nodded, smiling. "I think they've taken over, yes," he said, chuckling. Mark laughed along, his eyes twinkling. "Yeah, they're very enthusiastic helpers." He straightened up and motioned toward the chairs around the table. "Please, sit. Let's get this date started, properly, this time." John sat down, still smiling, as the girls climbed into their seats or perched on the edge, clearly not intending to leave the conversation entirely to the adults. They had questions, jokes, and observations, and they weren't shy about sharing them. "Do you like chocolate?" one asked, as if it were the most important topic in the world. John laughed and shook his head. "I like coffee more, but chocolate's good too," he replied. The girl nodded approvingly and whispered to her sisters, "He's approved." Chocolate approved. Mark and John shared a look, a silent acknowledgement that the girls were the real stars of this blind date. But surprisingly, the presence of the children made it much easier to talk. The tension John had felt earlier, the nervous energy of waiting and wondering if he'd connect with Mark, had completely dissipated. The girls had done the hard work of breaking the ice, and now the adults could finally relax. John began to ask Mark about his work and hobbies, and Mark responded with easy, natural conversation, often interrupted by the girls' antics. They pointed out interesting things on the menu, commented on the coffee shop decor, and even tried to involve John in small games, like guessing the number of sugar packets in the holder. Each time, the interruptions weren't annoying, they were charming, warm, and funny. At one point, the tallest girl leaned forward and said, "Daddy says you're funny, but I want to see for myself." John raised an eyebrow. "Funny how?" he asked. "Like, do I make you laugh, or?" She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Like silly funny. Tell a joke." John laughed softly, then told a small, harmless joke about coffee and muffins. The girls squealed with laughter, and even Mark chuckled. John realized then that the ice had not only been broken but completely shattered. What could have been a stiff, awkward date was now lively, joyful, and full of warmth. The conversation continued to flow naturally, with Mark and John swapping stories about work, hobbies, and funny childhood memories, while the girls occasionally chimed in with questions or playful comments. At one point, John found himself laughing so hard at one of the youngest daughter's observations that he nearly spilled his coffee. It was impossible not to enjoy the moment. The combination of humor, innocence, and genuine connection had made the date something memorable in ways he could never have imagined. John looked around the table and noticed the small details, The way Mark's eyes lit up when he spoke about his daughters, the way the girls bounced slightly in their chairs when they laughed, the way the coffee shop felt warmer and more welcoming than it had just an hour ago. It wasn't just a blind date anymore, it was an experience, a small adventure that was unfolding right in front of him. By the end of that first hour, John realized that the presence of the girls had completely changed the dynamic. Instead of awkward small talk and nervous glances, the conversation was genuine, heartfelt, and filled with laughter. They had taken a potentially stressful situation and turned it into something magical. John knew, even then, that this was the kind of story he would tell over and over, a blind date that started empty, became chaotic, and ended up being unexpectedly perfect. And in that moment, as the girls continued to giggle and Mark shared a funny story from his childhood, John couldn't help but think, sometimes, the best connections happen when you least expect them, and sometimes, the right people show up in the most unexpected ways. By the time Mark had fully joined John at the table, the coffee shop seemed to have transformed into a little universe of its own. The three girls were bouncing in their chairs, still chattering excitedly, while John and Mark tried to keep up with their energy. It wasn't just a blind date anymore, it was a small family circus, and everyone had a part to play. Mark finally took a deep breath and sat down opposite John, placing his briefcase carefully on the floor. "Wow," he said, glancing at his daughters. "I see you've already met. And you've taken over my side of the table completely, haven't you?" John laughed, shaking his head. "It's fine. I think they might be the best date planners I've ever met," he said. The girls grinned, clearly proud of themselves. One of them leaned forward, puffed out her chest, and said, "We make sure everything is perfect." Mark chuckled. "I can see that," he said. "I hope they haven't scared you off already." "Scared me off?" John repeated, raising his eyebrows. "Not at all. Honestly, I think they've made this the best blind date I've ever had. I've never met anyone who can break the ice quite like this," he said, nodding at the three girls, who beamed with pride. Mark smiled, looking genuinely relieved. "Good. I was worried about being late and making a bad first impression. But it looks like they handled everything perfectly." He glanced at John and added, "I'm really glad you were patient enough to wait. I know the start was unexpected." John laughed softly. "Unexpected is putting it lightly," he admitted. "But I can see now that waiting was worth it. You've got a great team here," he said, nodding toward the girls, who were now inspecting the coffee cups as if they were priceless treasures. Mark leaned back in his chair, glancing at his daughters with a proud smile. "They're full of energy," he said, "but they've been looking forward to this too. I think they wanted to make sure everything went smoothly for me." John nodded. "Well, they've succeeded. I've never laughed so much in the first 15 minutes of a blind date." One of the girls piped up suddenly, "Daddy, tell him the story about the frog again." Mark groaned dramatically, but the girls giggled, clearly excited to hear it told for the 5th time. He began narrating the story with exaggerated gestures and silly voices, and John found himself laughing along. The story was simple and funny, but the way Mark told it, animated, patient, and full of warmth, made it unforgettable. It was in that moment that John realized something important. The arrival of Mark wasn't just the physical presence of the man he had come to meet. It was the completion of the scene, the energy, laughter, and love that the girls had been channeling was now shared with their father, creating a bond that John could feel immediately. He wasn't just meeting a date, he was meeting a dad who genuinely cared about his daughters, and in turn, cared about making this meeting special. As the conversation shifted from silly stories to light-hearted questions about hobbies and favorite movies, John noticed how natural the interaction was. There was no forced small talk, no awkward pauses, no nervous energy. Instead, there was laughter, shared jokes, and a feeling of genuine connection. Even the girls occasionally chimed in with their opinions, which were both funny and surprisingly insightful, adding a unique charm to the date. Mark leaned slightly closer to John at one point and whispered, "I hope this isn't too overwhelming. They get excited easily." John smiled and shook his head. Overwhelming? Not at all. It's refreshing. Honestly, it's one of the most fun dates I've ever had. The girls, overhearing this, squealed with delight. We're fun, one shouted, and the others nodded vigorously. Mark laughed, shaking his head. Yes, yes you are, he said fondly. By now, John had completely forgotten his initial worries. The nerves, the empty chair, the awkward anticipation, it all felt like a distant memory. The girls had started the ice-breaking, and Mark's arrival had solidified it, turning a potentially ordinary blind date into a memorable adventure full of warmth, humor, and heart. As they sipped their coffee and shared small bites of muffins, John realized that this moment, unexpected, chaotic, and full of life, was exactly what he had hoped for, even if he didn't know it at first. The blind date, which had begun so quietly and nervously, had now transformed into something extraordinary, a story that would stay with him long after the coffee cups were empty. The coffee shop had transformed from a quiet, ordinary morning scene into a lively little bubble of laughter and chatter. John, Mark, and the three girls were now fully immersed in the moment, and for the first time, John felt completely at ease. The awkwardness that had plagued him at the start of the date had completely vanished. In its place was something rare, genuine connection, the kind that made time feel both fleeting and infinite at once. As the girls continued to giggle and exchange small, whispered secrets, Mark leaned toward John and said, "You know, I wasn't sure how this would go. I worried about being late and whether the kids would behave. But seeing them this excited, and seeing you join in, I can already tell this is going to be a great day." John smiled. "Honestly, I wasn't expecting to meet you through such enthusiastic ambassadors," he said, nodding toward the girls, who were now busy pretending to serve invisible tea to each other. "But I love it. It's fun, it's real. And I think it's helping me see a side of you I might never have noticed otherwise." Mark laughed. "Well, they do have a way of breaking the ice." He glanced at his daughters. "Don't you agree, girls?" "Totally," shouted the youngest, jumping slightly in her seat. The middle one nodded vigorously. The tallest leaned over and whispered to John, "We're experts at making people laugh." John chuckled. He had to admit, they were experts indeed. The girls' energy wasn't chaotic, it was infectious. Their laughter, playful teasing, and tiny antics had loosened him up in a way that no first-date conversation ever had. The earlier tension, the nervousness, the silent waiting, all of it had dissolved like sugar in hot coffee. Mark leaned back in his chair and started sharing stories from his childhood. He spoke about school pranks, summer vacations, and the little things he used to do that made him laugh. John listened intently, occasionally interjecting with his own stories. They found themselves finishing each other's sentences, laughing over similar experiences, and teasing each other lightly. Meanwhile, the girls had started creating their own games, making John participate with silly rules and funny challenges. One of them held up a sugar packet and declared, "If you guess how many marshmallows fit in the cup, you win." John played along, pretending to think seriously, and the girls squealed with delight when he gave the wrong answer. Even Mark laughed, shaking his head at their clever mischief. John realized then that these children were not just entertaining him, they were teaching him something. They reminded him to enjoy the moment, to laugh freely, and to connect without overthinking. The tension he had carried in his chest, the anxiety about whether this blind date would go well, had vanished completely. The moment was pure, full of warmth, and unfiltered joy. At one point, John and Mark shared a quiet laugh over a private joke about coffee shop etiquette, while the girls continued to chatter loudly around them. John glanced at Mark and noticed something subtle but important, the way Mark's eyes lit up when he spoke, the ease with which he laughed, the natural warmth he radiated. John realized that the man in front of him wasn't just charming, he was genuine, kind, and patient. And that realization made John feel a growing sense of connection he hadn't anticipated. The conversation flowed effortlessly from there. They talked about favorite movies, hobbies, and funny memories, all while the girls added their playful commentary. Every time someone laughed, the girls clapped their hands or squealed in approval, making the moment feel even more magical. It wasn't just a date anymore, it was a shared experience, a small world where everyone's happiness mattered, and every laugh counted. As the coffee cups emptied and the muffins disappeared, John leaned back and realized how much fun he had. What had started as an awkward, nerve-wracking blind date had transformed into something extraordinary. The laughter, connection, and genuine warmth of the moment were unforgettable. He felt grateful, not just for the chance to meet Mark, but for the girls, who had bridged the gap, broken the ice, and made the entire experience magical. By the time the date was winding down, John and Mark shared a look, a silent acknowledgement that this was just the beginning of something special. The girls, still giggling and whispering, were clearly proud of their work. John smiled, thinking to himself, sometimes, the most meaningful connections happen in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes, the laughter of children is the perfect spark to bring people together. The coffee shop had quieted down a little, though the energy from the last hour still lingered like a warm glow. John and Mark leaned back in their chairs, sipping the last of their coffee, while the three girls chattered happily between themselves, recounting every little detail of the morning as if it were the grandest adventure in history. John looked at them and smiled, realizing how much this blind date had turned into something far beyond what he had imagined. The girls had been the bridge, the icebreakers, the heartbeat of the morning. Their laughter had filled the space with warmth, their antics had made the tension vanish, and their pure excitement had created a bond that no small talk or awkward conversation ever could. John realized that sometimes, the unexpected chaos of life could lead to moments more meaningful than anything carefully planned. Mark, sensing the day winding down, leaned over to John and said, "Thank you for being patient. I know the start was unusual, and I really appreciate how you handled everything. I was nervous, but seeing you laugh with them, and with me, made it so much easier." John smiled, feeling a genuine warmth in his chest. Honestly, it was perfect. I couldn't have asked for a more memorable experience. They made everything so much fun. The tallest of the girls suddenly tugged at Mark's sleeve. "Daddy, can we have a goodbye hug for John? He's our new friend." Mark laughed softly and nodded. John grinned, kneeling slightly to meet their tiny arms wrapped around him in a surprisingly strong embrace. The middle girl squeezed him tightly, and the youngest gave a shy smile, patting his back as if sealing a secret pact of friendship. Mark ruffled their hair affectionately. "All right, ladies, I think that's enough excitement for one morning," he said, smiling at the girls. They reluctantly let go of John, but their eyes sparkled with pride and satisfaction. John laughed softly, realizing that the girls had orchestrated the perfect ending to this unusual, wonderful blind date. As Mark gathered his briefcase and the girls' backpacks, he looked back at John and said, "I really hope this isn't the last time we meet. I'd love to do this again, maybe without the coffee shop chaos next time, though I'm not sure it would be as fun without them." John shook his head, smiling. "No, I don't think it would be nearly as memorable. Honestly, this was one of the best mornings I've ever had." The girls, overhearing this, squealed with delight. "We did a good job, Daddy," one of them shouted. Mark laughed and nodded, acknowledging their proud declaration. "Yes, you did," he said, smiling warmly at them and then turning to John. "And you were amazing too. They're going to talk about this forever, I'm sure." John chuckled, thinking about the energy, chaos, and laughter that had filled the morning. The awkward start, the empty chair, the nervous anticipation, it all felt like a distant memory now. What remained was joy, warmth, and a story that would stay with him for a long time. As they walked toward the door, John noticed the smiles on the girls' faces, their little hands clinging to Mark's fingers, and the way they looked at him as if he were part of their small, wonderful world. He realized that this blind date, which had begun as a simple, ordinary plan, had transformed into something extraordinary because of the little sparks of life, energy, and love that these children had brought into it. Outside, the air was fresh, and the city hummed with its usual pace. But for John, time seemed to have slowed just a little. The day had started with nervous anticipation and ended with laughter, connection, and memories he would cherish. As he waved goodbye to Mark and the girls, he felt a sense of excitement for what might come next, not just with Mark, but with the unexpected joy that life could deliver when you least expect it. Walking away from the coffee shop, John smiled to himself. He realized that the perfect blind date wasn't about flawless conversation, a fancy location, or even meeting exactly who you imagined. It was about connection, laughter, and shared experiences, even if they came in the form of 3 small, mischievous, and utterly charming girls. And as he glanced back one last time to see them waving, he knew he had just witnessed something rare, a moment that was perfectly imperfect, full of life, humor, and heart. The blind date that had started empty had ended up unforgettable, and John couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected adventure that had changed his morning, and maybe his life, forever.